In March of 2024, Honda rolled out its first mass-market electric SUV in America, and for a moment, it looked like the company had actually pulled it off. 33,000 units sold in year one, a spot near the top of every EV sales chart that didn't already belong to Tesla. Then, a little over 2 years later, in July of 2026, Honda quietly confirmed what its own dealers had already started to suspect. The Prologue is dead, not paused, not getting a redesign, discontinued for good, with thousands of unsold units sitting on lots across the country, and price cuts north of $19,000 just to get them off the pavement. This isn't a story about a slow seller quietly fading off the order sheet. This is a story about a company that told the world it was going all in on electric vehicles, backed that promise with billions of dollars, and then watched almost every piece of it collapse inside the span of about 2 years. So how did Honda, a company that has spent almost 80 years selling the idea that it engineers everything itself, end up killing its only electric car and leaving its own dealers holding the bag? To answer that, you have to go back to a bombed-out Japanese city in 1948, long before anyone in Detroit or Tokyo was thinking about lithium. Soichiro Honda didn't start with cars. He started with piston rings, and he failed at that first, badly enough that Toyota rejected his early designs outright. What he built afterwards, in the rubble of post-war Hamamatsu, was smaller and stranger. A motorized bicycle cobbled together from surplus generator engines the Japanese military no longer needed. It sold. Then it sold again. By 1948, that workshop had become Honda Motor Company, built on a single stubborn idea the founder repeated for the rest of his life, that if a person could dream something, they could engineer it themselves rather than wait for someone else to build it for them. Honda called it the power of dreams, and for decades the company treated outside partnerships as something close to an admission of failure. It built its own motorcycle engines to beat European racing teams that had a decade's head start. It built its own Formula One program from scratch rather than buy an expertise. Even as Honda grew into one of the largest automakers on Earth, it stayed unusually private about how it got there, a company that solved its own problems in its own labs. That independence became the whole identity. It was the reason customers trusted a Honda badge to mean something specific about how the car underneath it was built, which makes what happened next so strange. Because when Honda finally decided it needed to compete in electric vehicles, on American soil, on an American timeline, the company that spent 70 years refusing to lean on anyone else went out and found a partner to build the car for it. The turn came fast once it started. In 2021, Honda became the first major Japanese automaker to publicly commit to phasing out gasoline vehicles entirely, targeting a lineup that was 100% electric or hydrogen by 2040. A year later, in April of 2022, that pledge got teeth. Honda announced it would launch 30 new electric models globally by 2030, and aim to build more than 2 million EVs a year, numbers that would have made it one of the largest electric automakers on the planet almost overnight. Behind the announcement sat a partnership with General Motors that had started quietly in 2020 and expanded fast, first into shared crossover SUVs, then into an ambitious plan to co-develop electric vehicles priced under $30,000 for a 2027 launch. Honda backed the ambition with real money. It committed $700 million to convert its Ohio manufacturing plant into what it called an EV hub, then followed that in 2023 with a $4.4 billion joint battery plant alongside LG Energy Solution, also in Ohio. By January of 2024, Honda had a showpiece to match the spending, unveiling its own ground-up Zero Series SUV and sedan at CES in Las Vegas, engineered entirely in-house on a new proprietary platform and running Honda's own software. Nothing borrowed, nothing badge-engineered. Honda executives described the design language as thin, light and wise, and promised the cars would be built at real volume in Ohio, not as a niche halo product. On paper, it was the most aggressive electrification plan any Japanese automaker had ever put in writing. But the vehicle that was actually about to reach American driveways first wasn't the Zero Series at all. It was something built almost entirely by somebody else. The Honda Prologue was never meant to prove Honda could build its own EV. It was meant to buy Honda time while it built one. Honda's in-house electric architecture, the one that would eventually become the Zero Series, was still years from production readiness, and American buyers weren't going to wait around for it. So Honda made a calculated choice: borrow General Motors' Ultium architecture, the shared battery and motor foundation already underneath the Chevrolet Blazer EV, and wrap Honda's own styling and suspension tuning around it. GM would handle the platform engineering and the manufacturing at its plant in Ramos Arizpe, Mexico. Honda would handle the badge, the interior, and the dealer network. It was framed internally as pragmatism, a fast way into a market segment Honda had no time to build from scratch, a bridge vehicle rather than a real answer. It wasn't framed as a compromise, but the timing turned it into one. In October of 2023, less than half a year before the Prologue was due to launch, Honda and GM abruptly cancelled the larger piece of their alliance, the joint program to build affordable sub-$30,000 EVs for 2027. Honda's CEO told reporters the economics simply didn't work as a business. That left the Prologue and its Acura sibling, the ZDX, as the only products the partnership would ever actually deliver, two rebadged General Motors crossovers standing in for what had been pitched as the start of a new era. Honda's own electric future was still years away in Ohio. Its first real answer to American EV buyers was going to be somebody else's car wearing its logo, and the bridge it was supposed to be crossing had just gotten a lot longer. For a while, that didn't seem to matter. The Prologue launched in March of 2024 and immediately outperformed expectations, moving over 33,000 units in its debut year, and briefly ranking among the top-selling electric vehicles in the country that weren't built by Tesla. Reviewers liked the range, the smoother ride than its Chevy cousin, and the roomy cabin. But nearly every review carried the same undertone. It felt, as one outlet put it bluntly, more GM than Honda. The car that was supposed to announce Honda's electric era instead read as a Chevrolet Blazer EV in a different suit, sold as Honda's electric future, built as somebody else's engineering exercise. Then the cracks that weren't just cosmetic started showing up. Owners began reporting a sharp, clicking noise from the front axles on tight turns, sometimes appearing with as little as 2,500 miles on the odometer. High-voltage system warnings started surfacing too, some severe enough to leave low-mileage cars limping at 25 miles an hour, or refusing to charge entirely until a dealer replaced the battery pack outright. A separate recall hit the instrument cluster and backup camera, a software fault serious enough that Honda technicians described the fix as something close to a brain transplant for the car's control modules. None of it was fatal on its own, but it meant the Prologue was inheriting GM's early production growing pains, along with GM's platform, at exactly the moment the ground underneath the entire EV market was about to shift. The shift came from Washington, not Detroit. In the fall of 2025, the Trump administration eliminated the $7,500 federal tax credit that had been quietly propping up EV demand across the industry, Honda included. The effect was immediate and brutal, but it wasn't just Honda. Hyundai pulled the Ioniq 6 sedan from the US market. BMW dropped the iX and the i4. Nissan walked away from the Ariya. Kia cancelled the EV4 before it ever launched here, and Volkswagen quietly shelved plans to bring the ID7 stateside at all. Ford had already killed the F-150 Lightning. Volvo cut both the EC40 and the entry-level EX30. Even Tesla trimmed slower-selling variants of the Model X and Model S as demand cooled. The entire segment was pulling back at once, and the political tailwind that had justified years of automaker EV spending simply evaporated overnight. Even GM's own Ultium platform, the foundation Honda had built the Prologue on top of, was buckling under the same pressure. Chevrolet sold just over 1,000 Blazer EVs in the first quarter of 2026, an 82% collapse from the same quarter a year earlier, after moving more than 22,000 of them across all of 2025. Competitors smelled blood and cut prices to match. Toyota rolled out 0% financing plus $3,500 in bonus cash on its own EVs. Subaru matched with $6,000 off the Solterra. On top of all of it, new tariff pressure on imported parts and vehicles added another layer of cost uncertainty that made every EV pricing decision harder to plan around. Honda wasn't losing to one rival. It was watching an entire category of vehicle it had bet billions on lose its reason for existing in the American market, all in the span of about 18 months. While the market turned against it from outside, Honda's own electric lineup was quietly falling apart from within. In September of 2025, the Acura ZDX, the Prologue's luxury twin and the other product of the GM alliance, was discontinued after barely 2 years on sale. 7 months later, in March of 2026, Acura pulled the plug on the RSX, an all-electric crossover that had been fully announced, tooled and scheduled, but never actually reached a single showroom. That same month brought the heaviest blow of all. Honda cancelled its own ground-up 0 Series SUV and 0 Series saloon, the very vehicles it had unveiled at CES with such confidence just 2 years earlier, alongside the RSX, in a single statement. 3 electric vehicles, engineered from scratch on Honda's own platform and its own software, dead before a single customer ever bought one. Production of all 3 had been scheduled for its retooled Marysville, Ohio plant. The same EV hub Honda had spent hundreds of millions of dollars converting for exactly this purpose. Honda disclosed that the retreat would cost the company up to $15.7 billion once every impairment, supplier settlement, and cancelled tooling contract was accounted for. Several senior executives took pay cuts of up to 30% as a result. Every electric vehicle Honda had engineered with its own people was gone. The only one left standing, ironically, was the one Honda hadn't fully built itself at all. On March 12, 2026, Honda confirmed something its shareholders hadn't seen since the company first listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 1957: a net loss. The company that had posted a profit of 835.8 billion yen just 1 fiscal year earlier now reported a net loss of 690 billion yen. A swing driven almost entirely by the wreckage of its electrification strategy. Impairment charges alone on the property, equipment and years of capitalized development work behind the cancelled EVs came to more than 500 billion yen. Money spent building factory lines and battery contracts for cars that would never reach a customer's driveway. Honda didn't stop at cancelling the 0 Series. It quietly scrapped its own headline targets alongside it, walking back the goal of having EVs make up 20% of global sales by 2030 and abandoning the 2040 all-electric pledge that had defined the company's public image for 5 years. A planned $11 billion EV and battery project in Ontario, Canada, was suspended indefinitely, its timeline left unspecified, its future essentially unknown even to the people who work there. Analysts covering the earnings call didn't mince words, essentially telling clients that the entire investment thesis behind Honda's electric push had stopped matching reality on the ground, a polite way of saying the company had badly misjudged the room. The company's own overall revenue, remarkably, still edged up slightly that year, propped up almost entirely by a booming motorcycle division and a financial services arm that had nothing to do with cars. That detail mattered, because it meant this wasn't a company on the brink of collapse. It was a company writing off a specific self-inflicted bet in public at a scale it had never had to admit to before. This was the moment the story stopped being about one disappointing SUV and became about a company reversing nearly every electric commitment it had made since 2020, all inside the space of a single earnings call. Honda's answer to all of it arrived a few weeks later, and it looked like an attempt to at least save the one EV still standing. On April 1st, 2026, Honda cut $7,500 off every Prologue trim, including vehicles already sitting on dealer lots, explicitly to offset the loss of the federal tax credit and start clearing the backlog building up at showrooms nationwide. The base EX dropped to $41,395. The top Elite trim fell to $51,895. On paper, it read like Honda was finally taking dealer inventory seriously, and it came bundled with 0.99% financing for up to 60 months to sweeten the deal further. Then analysts at Cars Direct went through the dealer incentive bulletins and found the other half of the story. At the same time Honda lowered the sticker price by $7,500, it quietly cut the dealer cash incentive from around $16,000 down to just $8,500, money that had previously been passed along to buyers as an extra discount stacked on top of the price. The net effect for most shoppers came out close to zero. One industry analysis called the price cut basically fake. On owner forums, some of the earliest Prologue buyers, the ones who had paid full price back in 2024 before any of these incentives existed, said plainly that they felt like they'd been played, watching lease payments on the same car fall from around $500 a month to under $200 in barely 18 months. Dealers weren't getting relief either. They were getting a rebranded version of the same problem, a lower number on the window sticker attached to a smaller check from Honda, on a car the manufacturer had already told them, quietly, would have no successor. Moving metal off a lot is hard enough when the buyer believes there's a next generation worth waiting for. It's a different problem entirely when everyone in the showroom already knows there isn't one. By July of 2026, there was nothing left to save. Honda confirmed to reporters that Prologue production would end with the completion of the 2026 model year, with existing inventory sold off into early 2027. First-half sales for 2026 had already fallen 48% year-over-year, even as the Prologue clung to a spot among the 10 best-selling EVs in the country. Honda had delivered more than 80,000 of them since that promising launch in 2024. None of it was enough. As of the 2027 model year, for the first time since it entered the segment, Honda will sell 0 electric vehicles in the United States. Dealers, meanwhile, are still working through the backlog, advertising leftover 2025 and 2026 Prologues with as much as $19,000 in combined discounts just to move them off the lot. Honda's public position is that its 2050 carbon neutrality pledge remains intact, and that a new generation of EVs, built entirely on Honda's own terms this time, will arrive once the economics make sense again, whenever that turns out to be. In the meantime, the company is pouring its Ohio hub's flexible capacity straight into hybrids, the Civic, the Accord, the CR-V, all leaning harder into the technology Honda actually built itself and never had to borrow from anyone. There's a version of this story that's just about one unlucky SUV caught in a bad market cycle. But the more honest version is about what happens when a company that spent 70 years selling the idea that you build your own future decides, just once, to rent someone else's instead. Honda got the car to market faster. It also got someone else's problems, someone else's timeline, and ultimately someone else's exit plan for a project that was never built to be permanent in the first place. The power of dreams was always Honda's promise that if you could imagine something, you could engineer it yourself. This time, Honda tried buying the dream second-hand, and it turns out you can't return a car you never actually built,